I was a year old, my mother actually gave me to a total stranger in the street to save my life, because she didn't know if she'd be alive the next day. So I didn't see her for a month. Deep sense of abandonment, not being wanted. Now, I don't recall that. I can't recall being handed to a stranger in the streets of Budapest, because there's nothing to recall with. The brain's organ in the brain, the hippocampus, that encodes recall memory is not developed then yet. It doesn't develop till later. But the emotional implicit memory of abandonment is deep in me. When there's a loss emotionally, that translates into biology. So it's not that there's biology here and our emotions here. It's that the emotions and the biology are completely inseparable. And what happens on the emotional plane inevitably will have its manifestations on a biological plane. So what you lose emotionally translates into biological events in your body. And that begins with brain development. I began to be interested in brain development when I was diagnosed with ADHD. I was 53, I think, 54, 53. And within a couple of months, 2 of my kids were diagnosed, which seemed to go along with the mainstream medical view that what we've got here is a genetic disorder, which I never bought into for a minute. And why didn't I buy into it? Because although I didn't know anything about the brain or how it developed, I knew something. The tuning out, the absent-mindedness that characterizes ADD is not a disease, inherited or otherwise. What is tuning out? It's an adaptive response to stress. So that if I were to stress you right now, but I mean that is to be verbally abusive, emotionally insulting, domineering, you would go into a stress state. And how could you deal with it? Well, you could just walk out the door. Or you could stand up and say, you can't talk to me like that, I will not accept it. And if you couldn't walk out, nor did you have the strength to confront me, to fight back, if flight or fight wasn't available to you, there's still a third thing you could do. There are, 100, 200 people here in the room with you, you could ask for help. But what if you couldn't do any of those things? Then how would you handle the stress? Well, you wouldn't. Your brain would handle it by a number of defense mechanisms, the salient of which would be dissociation. You dissociate, all of a sudden you're not here. Now you're not suffering as much. So it's simply a coping response, is all it is. The way we adapt to early stress helps us endure that difficult period in the life of the helpless child, but those same adaptations become sources of pathology, threaten your health, threaten the length, your longevity even. So what's adaptive in one situation, what's meant to be a temporary state, becomes a long-term trait. And when it goes from state to a trait, now it's a source of dysfunction and pathology. So that's what I intuited about the tuning out. But what I didn't know, and this is astonishing, is how the brain actually develops. And how the brain develops is in interaction with the environment. So that the brain is not genetically programmed. The potentials are genetically set, and the trajectory of development in terms of what circuits will develop when, that's set genetically, but how they will develop, how successfully they will unfold and connect, and what systems in the brain will become to dominate, that's not genetically programmed. That depends on the interaction of that individual with the environment. The most significant factor shaping the physiological development of the brain is the emotional relationship with the parenting environment. And the necessary condition for optimal brain development, which is so rarely available in North America, are parents who are emotionally available, consistently available, non-stressed, non-depressed, and mutually responsive or attuned to the child. Now, anything that interferes with the capacity of the parent to offer those qualities to the child will have its impact on brain development. So if you look at my ADHD, it's really easy to understand. I was born in Budapest, Hungary in 1944, Jewish parents. This is Second World War, and when I'm 2 months old, the Nazis occupy Hungary. The genocide had already exterminated most Jews in Eastern Europe. Now it was Hungary's turn. But the day after the Wehrmacht, the German army, marches into Budapest, my mother phones the pediatrician, and I'm 2 months old. And she says, "Would you please come and see Gabor, because he's crying all the time." And the pediatrician says, "Of course I'll come, but I'll tell you, all my Jewish babies are crying." Now, what are you supposed to be going on? I mean, as infants, what do we know about Nazis, Hitler, genocide, Second World War? Nothing. What are we responding to? The stress of our mothers. And the stress of our mothers program our brains. Now, what do you do as a 2-month-old, and that was my first year of my life, when your mother is depressed, terrorized, in grief over the death of her parents in Auschwitz, the absence of her husband in a forced labor camp? As a 2-month-old, as a 6-month-old, what do you do with that pain and stress? You tune it out. But when do you tune it out? When your brain is developing. When every second, there are periods in the first year of life, when every second, in this space of time, millions of brain connections are being made. Guess what? That adaptation of tuning out goes from a temporary state to a trait. And so 52 years later, I'm finally diagnosed with ADHD. Why my kids? My kids grew up in Vancouver, no war, my kids weren't abused, there was no substance addiction, I wasn't an alcoholic or anything like that. I was a workaholic physician. Why was I a workaholic physician? Because the message I got from the world very early on is I wasn't wanted. Not because my mother didn't want me, but for the child to feel wanted, the mother has to be happy. The mother has to be emotionally present. And children, when they don't get that, it's all about themselves. Children are truly narcissistic in that sense. It's not a pejorative, just a statement of reality. They think it's all about themselves. They think it's all about themselves. When you see a narcissistic personality, what you're seeing is a highly traumatized person who still thinks it's all about him because he didn't get those needs met as a child. So he's still trying to get it. Pay attention to me. So the personality that we develop actually is an adaptation. And then when I was a year old, my mother actually gave me to a total stranger in the street to save my life because she didn't know if she'd be alive the next day. And so I didn't see her for a month. Deep sense of abandonment, not being wanted. Now, I don't recall that. I can't recall being handed to a stranger in the streets of Budapest because there's nothing to recall with. The brain's organ in the brain, the hippocampus that encodes recall memory, is not developed then yet. It doesn't develop till later. But the emotional implicit memory of abandonment is deep in me, so that when 5 weeks ago I arrived home from Vancouver, from Philadelphia, from a speaking engagement, I'm feeling really good about myself. I think I'm really centered and grounded, haha. And my wife does not pick me up at the airport, or she texts me saying I'll be 15 minutes late. I go into a rage. What's that rage about? The woman whom I need is not here for me. That's an implicit memory. And we're governed by these implicit memories until we become aware, until we become conscious, until I can notice that anger rising up in me. Anger rising. What's that about? Like Thich Nhat Hanh talks about calming. First of all, you recognize that there's an emotion arising inside you, and then he says, you accept it. Right now, there's anger. And then you hold the anger mindfully, like you'd hold a baby. Then you look, what is it actually all about? And then the insight comes, this is old stuff. Okay, well then, nothing to be upset about, right? So the solution is mindfulness, but I'm laying out the problem for you, which is the implicit memories. Now with my children, and so since I wasn't wanted, I have to compensate. Now how do you compensate for not being wanted? By making yourself needed. They may not want me, but they're going to need me. So this is going to be on all the time. And I'm available for all my patients all the time, 24/7. And I'll never say no to taking on more patients, because that's another sign that I'm being wanted, right? We're needed. Where does that leave my kids? With the sense that they're not wanted because daddy's not around. And mommy is so stressed because daddy's not around. So they tune out. Now they're diagnosed with ADD. Genetic disease? Nonsense. Multi-generational trauma and stress being passed on as it affects brain development. And if you want to understand why we're seeing a preponderance of childhood developmental disorders, like all these diagnoses, autism, 40-fold increase, but all these diagnoses, behavior problems, the school problem, the learning difficulties, you know what we're looking at? We're looking at the biology of loss as it's affecting the brains of our children, and then how we respond to it is with medications and behavior control, instead of saying, what's going on here? Or what's going on here is that our children are acting out their lost attachment relationships.